Someone in your life is running a test right now. Not in a laboratory, not with instruments or recorded data, but with the quiet, methodical patience of someone who has learned, through practice, that people reveal their full architecture if you simply press them in the right sequence. They press once, lightly, and they watch. They watch how you respond, how long it takes, how much you absorb before you react, whether you react at all. They note where the edges are soft. They file the information. And then they press again, slightly differently, in a slightly different location, building a map of you that you did not consent to provide, and may not even realize you have been giving. This is not the stuff of dramatic conspiracy. It is the quiet, ordinary, entirely deniable mechanics of how certain people navigate social environments. Friedrich Nietzsche called it the instinct of domination operating beneath the surface of polite interaction, not in those who announce their intentions, but in those who never announce anything, who simply observe, accumulate, and adjust. He studied this pattern across centuries of human organization and found it as present in intimate relationships as in the courts of empires. The scale changes. The mechanism does not. These 7 rules are what he found when he looked at the individuals who moved through this landscape without being consumed by it. Not the aggressive, not the ruthless. The aware. And awareness, Nietzsche argued with everything he wrote, is the only thing that goodness ever actually needs to protect itself. Not weapons, not coldness, not the abandonment of genuine care. Simply the refusal to be studied without studying back. Before the first rule, understand the lens Nietzsche applied to all of this. He was not writing about human nature at its worst, as though it were exceptional. He was writing about it as though it were structural, as though the drive to assess, to position, to determine who is safe to press and who will press back, were not a pathology, but a feature of how human beings have always navigated environments where resources, recognition, and power are finite. He was not condemning it. He was insisting that the person who refuses to acknowledge it is not elevated by their refusal. They are simply less equipped to navigate it. The terrain exists. The map either exists in your hands, or it exists only in someone else's. The first rule: you are always being assessed, whether or not you have chosen to participate in the assessment. The naive belief that most genuinely good people carry is that social environments are essentially neutral until proven otherwise, that the default posture of the people around them is goodwill, or at least indifference, and that only demonstrated hostility warrants recalibration. This belief is not entirely wrong about the majority of people, but it is precisely wrong about the subset of people who operate according to different principles entirely. And the challenge is that this subset does not announce itself. It presents identically to genuine goodwill until the accumulated data makes the distinction necessary. Nietzsche observed, in his study of what he called the will to power in its social expression, that the assessment of others is not an aberration of human nature. It is one of its most consistent features. Every person you have ever met formed a working hypothesis about you within moments of encounter. Most of those hypotheses are benign and provisional, but some are being refined and tested across every subsequent interaction. The question is not whether you are being read. You are always being read. The question is whether you are reading back, whether you are bringing to social environments the same quality of observation that some of those environments are bringing to you. Perception does not wait for an invitation. It forms regardless of whether you are managing it. The person who understands this does not become paranoid. They become deliberate. They move through social environments with the quiet attention of someone who knows that everything they reveal is being catalogued by someone, and that the catalogue will be used, if not now, then eventually, when the situation warrants it. Not cruelty, attention, the same quality of attention that was already being paid to them. The second rule: your emotional reactions are not just feelings. They are data points someone else is collecting. There is a particular kind of person who learns very early that they do not need to ask direct questions to understand another person's interior. They simply create conditions. They say something slightly provocative and watch the response. They withdraw slightly and measure the pursuit. They offer praise and note how much the other person expands. They introduce mild criticism and observe how much the other person contracts. None of this looks like testing. It looks like conversation, like ordinary social interaction, like the natural variability of human exchange. And meanwhile, they are building, interaction by interaction, a precise map of what moves you, what stabilizes you, what you need and what you fear, and what, when applied at the right moment, can reliably produce the response they require. Nietzsche was explicit about this dynamic in his observations on what he called the psychology of the weak. Not weakness of character, but weakness in the sense of reactivity, of being more fully governed by external stimuli than by internal orientation. The reactive person, he argued, is always at a disadvantage in any environment containing someone who has learned to generate stimuli deliberately. Because the reactive person's behavior is, in a meaningful sense, not entirely their own. It is the predictable output of a system that has been mapped by someone paying closer attention than they were. The response to this is not the suppression of reaction. It is the development of what Nietzsche admired most: the capacity to feel completely and reveal selectively, to allow the full weight of internal experience without making that experience immediately legible to everyone in the room. This is not performance. It is sovereignty, the maintenance of an interior that belongs to you, that you disclose by choice rather than by reflex. The person who has built this composure does not become less human. They become less governable. And those two things, in any environment containing people who test, are not the same. The third rule: every time you absorb deliberate harm without response, you are not forgiving. You are publishing the price of your compliance. The experiment that someone runs on you is partly about discovery and partly about calibration. Discovery is, what are this person's limits? Calibration is, how far can those limits be moved? And the calibration phase depends entirely on your responses. Every transgression that was absorbed without cost calibrates the experiment toward greater transgression. Every boundary that dissolved under pressure calibrates toward more pressure. Not because the person testing you has necessarily made a conscious decision to escalate, but because the system they are operating, the map they are building, records each interaction as data about what is possible, and what is possible expands to fill the space that resistance would otherwise occupy. Nietzsche saw this mechanism everywhere he looked: in the dynamics of imperial Rome, where deference to power was systematically misread as endorsement of its expansion. In the intimate structures of European social life, where the person who accommodated most was always the one who ended up accommodating most. He wrote that what is not actively refused is passively permitted, and what is passively permitted is eventually treated as right by those who benefit from it. The forgiveness that follows transgression without requiring anything, no real acknowledgement, no adjusted behavior, no demonstrated cost, is not generosity. It is a published rate card. It tells the experimenter exactly what they are allowed to do and what they will spend for it. And the rate is always cheaper than they expected. The response required here is not anger. It is not confrontation pursued for its own sake. It is simply the clear, consistent demonstration that behavior has consequences, that your limits are not hypothetical, that your accommodation has a structure, and that the structure has edges. The person who has learned this about you will recalibrate, because the experiment requires feedback, and you are now providing different data. The fourth rule, the strength you display before you are secure is an asset you have donated to the people most likely to use it against you. Every environment contains people who are threatened by potential and people who are threatened by established fact. Potential can be managed. It can be minimized, undermined, mischaracterized, suppressed before it has the resources to defend itself. Established fact is much harder to contest. And the difference between those two positions is determined almost entirely by timing, by whether you made yourself legible before or after you had built the structural security to protect what you revealed. Nietzsche observed this in the careers of the most capable individuals across the political histories he studied. Those who announced their ambitions early, who were transparent about their capacity, their goals, their vision for themselves, consistently encountered organized opposition that they could not manage, because the opposition had time to organize before the capable person had time to consolidate. Those who moved quietly, who built alliances and stability before making their strength visible, arrived at positions of established fact that their opposition discovered too late to contest effectively. The announcement of potential is an invitation to suppression. The demonstration of established competence is a different conversation entirely. In any contemporary environment, professional, social, creative, the practical consequence is the same. Build before you declare. Position before you reveal. Let the results accumulate into something that requires more effort to contest than most opposition is willing to spend. And then let the results make the announcement that your words would have made prematurely. Patience here is not timidity. It is the most sophisticated form of strategic clarity available. The fifth rule: love creates attachment, but respect creates structure. And structure is the only thing that holds when feeling fails. The person running the psychological experiment on you, the one who has been watching and testing and mapping, knows something that most people resist knowing about themselves. They know that emotional attachment, once established, is one of the most reliable mechanisms for compliance ever discovered. Because the person who loves or needs or is deeply attached to another person has something to lose, and the person who has something to lose can be managed through the threat of losing it. This is what Nietzsche understood about affection, that most people never fully reckon with. That love, in its raw form, is a vulnerability as much as it is a gift. Not because love is bad, Nietzsche never argued that, but because love without the structural counterweight of genuine mutual respect creates an asymmetry that the calculating person will always find and always exploit. The person who is loved but not respected has access to the most private interior of another person, to their fears and their needs and their deepest attachments, without the accountability that genuine respect would require of them. And history is full, personal histories and documented political histories alike, of people who were loved fully and managed thoroughly, because the love was never balanced by the kind of structural respect that creates real accountability. Build relationships in which you are genuinely respected, in which your maintained standards, your demonstrated capability, your consistent alignment of word and action have created something that holds when the feeling becomes complicated. Because feeling always becomes complicated. And what remains in the complicated terrain of any long relationship is what was built rather than what was felt. And now, before the final two rules, a question that everything above has been pressing toward. Because if you have been reading carefully, some part of you is resisting. Not the logic. The logic is legible enough. Something older and more constitutionally necessary is resisting. The belief that the world cannot actually be this calculated in its ordinary operations. That the people close to you cannot actually be running experiments. That there must be a way to hold on to the simpler, cleaner, more generous interpretation of the social world, without paying the price that interpretation consistently charges. Nietzsche knew this resistance. He called it the will to comfortable illusion, not stupidity, not weakness, but the genuine human need for a world that is sufficiently fair to be lived in without constant vigilance. He took the need seriously. And then he made the argument that cost him more readers than any other argument he ever made. The illusion, while it provides comfort, does not reduce the operation of the forces it obscures. The experiment continues whether or not you acknowledge it is being run. The map of your interior is being built whether or not you consent to the building. The person who refuses to see this is not elevated by their refusal. They simply experience the consequences without understanding their source. And understanding the source, Nietzsche insisted, is the beginning of the only genuine liberation available. Not the liberation of a world without these forces. The liberation of someone who can see them clearly enough to move through them without being defined by them. The sixth rule: every battle you fight in public is a lesson in what reaches you, and your adversaries are taking notes. The person who has been running experiments on you has already learned, through observation, what matters enough to you that you will spend yourself defending it. They have watched you argue, have noted what provokes you past your usual composure, have catalogued the specific forms of dismissal or attack that reliably disrupt your stability. And every public confrontation you engage in, every visible battle, won or lost, adds to that catalogue. It tells everyone watching exactly which levers produce results, which pressure points are still active, where the map of your interior is most legible under stress. Nietzsche observed in the power structures of his era, what historians had documented across every era before his. The most durable forms of influence were never built through confrontation. They were built through the slow, patient accumulation of position, through the construction of a reality in which opposing you was structurally unattractive, in which your detractors found themselves in the peculiar position of spending effort on someone who was no longer paying attention to them at all. The person who has elevated past the fight does not win the argument. They make the argument irrelevant. And irrelevance, for those who sought to diminish you, is the most complete defeat available. Choose your battles by a single criterion, whether winning them builds something or merely confirms that you can be provoked. The seventh rule, and the one that ends the experiment permanently. When you have mastered your own interior, you remove the only variable the experimenter was ever actually testing. Think back to the beginning. The test being run on you is not, at its foundation, a test of your capabilities or your goodness or even your intelligence. It is a test of your reactivity. It is a test of how reliably your internal state can be produced from the outside, how consistently the experimenter can generate a predictable result by applying a known stimulus. The entire map they have been building is a map of your reactions. And the map is only useful as long as the reactions are available. The person who has built genuine interior sovereignty, who has done the patient, demanding work of becoming the primary author of their own internal state, rather than a predictable responder to external stimuli, has dismantled the experiment at its foundation. Not by becoming unreachable, not by becoming emotionally sealed against all human experience, by becoming, in the deepest sense, ungovernable by anything they did not choose to be governed by. The flattery that once opened them too fully still registers, but it no longer operates them. The dismissal that once destabilized them still lands, but it no longer reorganizes them. The particular tests that were calibrated through patient observation to produce reliable results stop producing the results the experiment predicted. And the experimenter, finding no usable data, moves on. This is not the transformation of someone who has become harder. It is the transformation of someone who has become complete, whose center holds regardless of the weather outside it, whose response to the world is chosen rather than triggered, whose interior has been sufficiently claimed that no one else can occupy it without invitation. The psychological experiment ends, not because the experimenter becomes good, but because you have become, finally and irrevocably, an unsatisfying subject. You were always the variable they were counting on, and now you are the one variable they cannot control. That is the transformation, not victory over your enemies, not immunity to human darkness. The simple, permanent, deeply unsettling, to them, fact of someone who can no longer be experimentally induced into being less than they are.